All right. So we've got Lawrence Krauss here. So for anyone who isn't familiar yet, Lawrence Krauss is a physicist, and he's most well known in these communities for arguments on atheism and with Christians, mostly creationists, I assume, from my experience. So
Well,
I
I guess, yeah,
go
I
ahead.
suppose that's it. I suppose I'm a physicist, and yeah, so I write a lot about science, more than atheism. But anyway,
So let's just get right into it here. Fox Terrier asks, philosophically, what school of thought do you follow, and what implications does that have for your work in the field of science?
I don't follow any school of thought. I follow the scientific method, I guess is the way of saying it. I follow empirical evidence and rational thought, a logical, rational thinking is applied to empirical evidence, and and hopefully rational discussion. So science is a process based on making decisions based on evidence, and then inferring what to do based on evidence, and then testing those inferences, and if they fail, throwing them out. So I don't follow any specific philosophy, but I try and follow that particular methodology, which is a scientific one.
Okay. Whiskey Renegade writes that he's always imagined thoughts are just waves of electricity and chemicals propagating and interacting in the brain. How does free will come into play there?
Well, that's a deep question. I, thoughts are a series of electric impulses in our brains managed by neurons that connect to one another and produce outputs. And in fact, I think it's pretty clear to most scientists who thought about it that at a fundamental level there is no such thing as free will. Namely, the world is deterministic. It's governed by laws of physics, and those laws of physics are deterministic, even quantum mechanics. But on the other hand, when you have many inputs and many variables, the world on the scales that we live in is, for all intents and purposes, identical to a world in which there appears to be free will. So the bottom line is, I think there is no such, at a fundamental level, indeterminism or free will, but we might as well act at human scales as if there is free will and take responsibilities for our actions, because the world is effectively, operationally indistinguishable one from one in which there is. But we can't possibly know all the causes for every action, or all the consequences of every action in general. We're in a complex system, and so we might as well act and take responsibilities if we have free will.
All right. So I know you wrote a book about this, but Teddy Bear asks, how do you think the universe could be created from nothing?
Easily. The point is that the laws of physics the laws of quantum mechanics allow particles to pop in and out of existence from nothing. That happens all the time, and it's an essential part of what governs our lives, and the properties of atoms and molecules that make up everything we see. So quantum mechanics allows for that. And the question is, if you apply quantum mechanics to nature, space and time, can space and time, namely universes, pop into existence from nothing? And that's possible in principle, although we don't have a theory of quantum gravity. If gravity is governed by quantum mechanical processes, then space and time are quantum mechanical variables, and we could literally have universes pop into existence from nothing. The ones that would not disappear immediately by the uncertainty principle would be ones that have zero total energy, which is possible to have. In fact, it's possible that our universe has zero total energy. The positive energy of mass of atoms and particles and other things is countered by the negative energy of gravitational attraction. And so if you pop in a universe that has zero total energy, it can persist for an arbitrarily long time, and you can then have a universe that eventually fills up with matter, and enough matter to make 100 billion galaxies, each containing 100 billion stars, which is the universe we appear to live in. So it's a plausible process that doesn't require any supernatural shenanigans, We do not have a fundamental theory to describe it at this point, however, because we do not have a fundamental theory of quantum gravity. But it's certainly plausible, and you certainly, given what we know now, it's, in fact, if you asked what would be the properties of a universe that originated from absolutely nothing, then it turns out and that lived 13.5 billion years so we could observe it today, you'd find that the properties of that universe would look almost identical to the properties of the universe we live in, which is highly suggestive at the very least.
All right. So this is in reference to the next question, but I just want to point out that these questions, they seem to be phrased a little bit weirdly. I can't really phrase all of them, so
Okay.
just want to put it out there. Don't yell at me. So anarcho-communist John asks, Christians usually point towards many eyewitnesses as proof, and the disciples dying for something they absolutely knew was true, since a normal person would not die for a lie. How can this be countered?
Oh, people die for lies all the time.
Okay.
I mean, often that's what wars are about. I don't see people could believe things. People, the remarkable thing about people is that they are not always rational, but more importantly, they can be driven to believe in something whether it's true or not. And the fact that people believe in it doesn't mean it's true. And the fact that you don't believe it doesn't mean it's not true. The universe, there was a Big Bang, whether or not you believe it. The universe is 13.5 billion years old, whether or not you believe it. But so I think the fact that people are willing to sacrifice their lives for something, be it their God or their president or their Führer or whatever, is just an example of the fact that people can be strongly driven by either ideology or religion to act in ways that may not be rational.
All right. User Feel the Burn asks, what is the main difference between Islam and Christianity in terms of their effect on humanity from your perspective as an atheist?
Well, look, I mean, the point is that, first of all, Islam is a much younger religion. If you look at where Christianity was 600 years ago or 700 years ago, you'll find not just the Inquisition, but the Crusades. And so it's the main difference that I can see between the religions is that more people, by Christianity and Judaism, are both so sort of mature in a sense that no one takes them that seriously, in the sense that very few people believe everything in the Bible as if it's true. Very few people. Almost all quote unquote Christians pick what they like and throw out the rest. They don't believe in even let's say the virgin birth or whatever else, or the stories in the Old Testament. They pick and choose what they want. In Islam, you find there's much more fundamentalism, where every word of that document is taken to be absolutely true. And that's the problem, it seems to me. That's the major difference, because Islam would not be different than Christianity and Judaism if people said, yeah, okay, well, that's my sacred book, and some of the things in it seem kind of silly, but I'll ignore those, and I'll just take the things that help me lead the life I feel I want to live. Then there'd be no real difference between Islam and Christianity. And one hopes over time that's what'll happen. But we'll see.
All right. Our next question comes from Cosmic Slice. Cosmic Slice asks, you noted in your book about Richard Feynman, am I saying that right?
Yeah, Feynman, yes.
Okay, that you noted that he asked the right questions. What questions are you asking right now, and do you think we are close to answering any of them?
Well, first of all, you don't know if you're asking the right question till much later, till you find out it leads somewhere productive. Some of the questions I've been asking are of course the energy of the universe it turns out the dominant energy density of the universe resides in empty space. It's the biggest mystery in physics. We don't know why empty space has energy. It actually weighs something, and there's nothing there. And of course, one of the big important questions is, why is that the case? And I should say it's not a why question, it's a how question. As I also have said in my book, why questions are really not a part of physics. We use the word why, but we really mean how. Because why implies some purpose. And there's no evidence that there's any purpose in nature. We really care about how could it come to pass that empty space has energy? And that's certainly one of the most important questions we're asking. But there are other questions that are relevant for me. Are there? Well, probably the most significant, deepest question is: did the universe have to be the way it is? When I was growing up, and I became a physicist, the prevailing sort of zeitgeist was that our job was to find the laws of nature, and the laws of nature were unique. They had to be what they were in order for our universe to exist. But now that's dramatically changed. We recognize there could be potentially many, many different types of universes with different laws of physics that are all consistent. And the question I'd like to know is that really the case? Did the universe have to be the way it is, and or not? And that's a foundational question. It's such a deep question. I expect we won't be able to answer it for some time. Same with the nature of dark energy, the energy of empty space. But there are other little puzzles that occur to me. It turns out there's a puzzle when one of the things people may not realize, but amazed me when I was in high school when I first learned it, is that the dominant particle in your body, the neutron, most of your atoms have more neutrons than protons. So the dominant elementary particle in your body, neutrons, are actually unstable. They have a lifetime of 10 minutes. If they're free, if you have a neutron in empty space, it'll decay in about 10 minutes. They don't decay when they're in nuclei, which is fortunate for us because otherwise we couldn't have a AMA that was longer than 10 minutes long. But which may or may not be fortunate now that I think about it. But anyway, there's a puzzle with that. It turns out different ways of measuring the neutron decay give different lifetimes, and it's very, very strange. And I've been thinking about ways to try and resolve that. It's not a profound, maybe it will be a profound question, but it's an interesting one to me. So the questions I'm asking vary from small to large, and the smaller ones are sometimes easier. Sometimes they lead you in directions you didn't imagine. Perhaps the other important question is that we have the most successful model with the picture of science that we've had in our history, the greatest intellectual edifice that humans have created, in my opinion, called the Standard Model of Particle Physics. And I wrote a whole book about it. My last book, called The Greatest Story Ever Told So Far, is about it. But we don't know. We know it's not complete, and we don't know why we know there are four forces in nature. We think perhaps they're unified together at some scale, certainly three of them. We don't know how that happens. We don't know why the forces have different magnitudes of strength. That's one of the things we're trying to learn at the Large Hadron Collider. So those are the most urgent, immediate questions in the realm of fundamental physics, at least.
All right. And Chaim asks, do you think knowledge, for the sake of knowledge?
I didn't hear all of that. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Do you think knowledge for its own sake is good?
Of course. Why wouldn't it be? I mean, the point is that we're here for a short time on Earth, and it seems to me as human beings, we want to explore and understand and enjoy the universe in which we live by asking questions about it. And one of the interesting things about science, I sometimes say it's unfortunate, but it isn't really. One of the things that distinguishes science from other areas of human intellectual inquiry at some level is that it produces technology. So people tend to think science is only useful when it produces technology. We'll make a better toaster, a faster car, or better batteries. But it seems to me the most interesting aspect of science is the same as what art, music, and literature do for us. They enhance our lives by changing our perspective of our place in the universe. They broaden our view of ourselves and our understanding of our place in the universe. And to me, that's the most exciting aspect of science. Far more, at a fundamental way, far more exciting than the fascinating technologies we're producing. And I think that's been true over history. We don't remember so much the plumbing of the Romans, although it was pretty good, I'm told. We remember their ideas and their contributions to inquiry and self-understanding. And so I think knowledge is is in some sense what all of us are striving to increase as we live, and what that knowledge does is enhance our understanding of ourselves, and in principle, in the best of all cases, it also increases the joy of being alive.
Okay. So the user brought up an example of nuclear fusion, that, the same kind of technology that brought us nuclear power, it also brought us nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
So, like, do you have any concerns about that? I mean, even if you just say, like, in the hands of humans?
Of course I have concerns. It's one of the reasons for over a dozen years I was chairman of the board of sponsors of the Bolton the Atomic Scientists, whose job was to alert the world to the danger of nuclear weapons. It would be wonderful if we could get rid of them and or at least control them rationally, instead of what every country is doing, which is being irrational about it. The United States talks the talk of non-proliferation, but it doesn't walk the walk. Part of the non-proliferation treaty that was signed so many years ago was not just that non-nuclear countries would not acquire nuclear weapons, but that nuclear countries would disarm. And the United States is making no efforts in that regard. Neither is Russia or the other nuclear states. And so they're not sending a message to the non-nuclear states that, hey, nuclear weapons are not a good thing. So, of course, I have concerns about that. On the other hand, if you're suggesting to me that science is bad because some of the products of science can be used for harm, well, that's, I think, inappropriate. And as my friend and colleague Steven Pinker used to say, you could say that about architecture. That architecture isn't good because some of the architects designed the death camps in Nazi Germany. And look, that architecture was bad. Well, technology can be used for good or bad, and by increasing our wisdom, we can try and use it for good. And one of the things that scientists like me, not all scientists, but some scientists should be doing, is trying to provide the information to the public and governments so that they can make wise decisions about how to act given the technologies we develop. And so I think it's extremely important for scientists not to be making policy themselves, but to be providing the information for policymakers and, more importantly, for the public. Because in the end, democracy or dictatorship, it doesn't really matter. Ultimately, politicians rarely lead. They almost always follow. And if there's huge public movement in a certain way, generally politicians will follow.
All right. This next question, I really like this one. Bait asks, do you think there is a pathway to is without relying on observation to demonstrate its reliability?
Well, I would have loved to answer that question, but you keep cutting out on me. So I don't know why I'm not hearing you.
I'm so sorry. Bait asks, do you think there is a pathway to show observation is reliable without relying on observation to demonstrate its reliability?
Yeah, of course. The answer is use the observations to make predictions about things that have not yet happened. For example, make a prediction about what would happen if you opened the window on the 10th floor of an office building and walked out. Now, don't do it. But so the point of observation, which is experiment, is useful and reliable if it allows us to make predictions that allow us to then perform actions which we can test. So if the predictions agree with later observations or allow us to take things that work well, then those observations are useful. It's the empirical method, testing. So you can test an observation by making a prediction based on that observation.
Okay. So Raymond has a question. I'm just going to rephrase this one. But Raymond's basically asking, when you talk about, the universe from nothing, Raymond's saying that it sounds like you actually mean it's from something. Do you actually mean that it's from nothing?
Well, look, we don't have time in this AMA to go into this in detail. It depends what you mean by something. And it's not so subtle. It is subtle. Sorry, it's not so obvious. Nothing. What do you mean by nothing? And I try very carefully in that book to describe the different ways science talks about nothing. But I think the most important thing that I try to illustrate is that at a fundamental level, and this is a remarkable development in science, we have discovered that the difference between something and nothing is not so significant. That nothing can turn into something and something can turn into nothing. If by nothing you mean no particles or, no radiation, empty space, for example, that's one kind of nothing. Maybe having no space is another kind of nothing. So you have to be kind of careful and define your terms, but realizing that the way scientists define certain terms and as a result of the developments in physics and other areas is not the same as the way that we colloquially describe those terms, so that things like theory or nothing can't be bandied about without perhaps defining them a little bit better.
Okay. So I'm just relaying this, but Sethical wants to get your thoughts on a verse from the Quran. The verse says,
Okay.
"Do the disbelievers not see that the heavens and the earth were one, yet we clove them asunder, and that we made from water every living thing? Will they then not believe?" And Sethical sees this as a proof against atheism and is wondering what your thoughts are on it.
Well, it doesn't have much meaning, and it's not true. So the point is that the heavens and the earth were not once together. The earth was there are heavens that were never part of the earth. That's one of the wonderful things about observation, that there are 100 billion galaxies. There are galaxies that are billions of light years away from us that have nothing to do with us. I mean, they're vague statements, but they don't allow you to predict anything, and they don't really mean anything. And in general, they're wrong, because you've got to understand they were written at the time when people didn't even know that the earth orbited the sun. So why should you expect those books to have any wisdom is beyond me. And there's nothing in that sentence that you gave that expresses any clear wisdom or evidence about the world that is that allows us to determine how we should live, in my opinion.
All right.
You can read me that sentence again, and I'll try and parse it more carefully. If you want to read it,
Sure.
Okay.
So it's 3 questions in this verse. The first is, do the disbelievers not see that the heavens and the earth were one, yet we clove them asunder?
Well, we didn't cleave. Okay, that's clear nonsense. We didn't cleave them asunder. They were never one, in the sense that well, it's wrong for one of 2 reasons. Either you say they were not one because there were places that were separate for us, or you can say we're all star children and we're still one. We're not cloved asunder. The atoms and elements that are in the earth are the same ones that are in the rest of the galaxy. So either way, no matter how you interpret that statement, it's meaningless. Mm-hmm.
And then it says, and that we made from water every living thing.
And well, I don't know who we is, and the point is that we actually make it from water, but also from air, carbon dioxide, and from rocks, and the elements that make us up include many things beyond water. Water has H2O, but the elements that make up life are not just carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and iron, but also things, lots of trace elements like potassium, and you go on. And so again, that statement again is kind of rather meaningless. Maybe we should move on to something sensible.
Sure. Okay. So if you wouldn't mind, let's go on to some more serious questions here. What are your thoughts on pineapple on pizza?
It depends on my mood. I'm not. It's not the first thing I choose, but I will eat it if given a slice.
Ooh, that's the most controversial thing I think I've heard you say tonight.
Okay, thank you. I just want to show how ecumenical I am. People may think I'm dogmatic. I don't think so.
All right. So one more fun question before you get back in some really solid ones. Mike Escape asks, would you rather fight a lion or a cheetah?
I wouldn't like to fight them. I like them. I played with cheetahs once, but I like lions and cheetahs. So I'd prefer to fight neither. And I don't see, um, if you meant, well, which one would I? Well, no, I wouldn't fight either. I don't like those questions because, of course, it presumes that I have no choice.
Yeah.
And um, I think if I was presented in a jungle with a lion and a cheetah looking at me, I'd somehow try and convince them to fight each other.
All right. So BBLL Road asks, how is cosmology and theoretical physics able to confidently dismantle religion?
Well, it's not designed to conflict dismantle religion. I mean, it does it by de facto. Look, science. Some people seem to think that God is significant. When it comes to science, God is irrelevant. I've been a physicist for over 40 years. I've never heard the word God mentioned in any scientific meeting I've ever been a part of. God is irrelevant. Science describes the universe the way it is without the presumption of supernatural shenanigans. And it's done a pretty darn good job. And so the more effective science is in explaining a universe without any purpose or direction or obvious evidence of direction, the more effectively you wish. If science suggests that religion doesn't that many of the tenets of religion are not necessary. But the purpose of science is not to get rid of God. The purpose of science is to understand the way the world works. And what we've discovered is the world can work pretty well. We understand the way the world works pretty well without ever mentioning that notion. And that's meant one of the reasons why most scientists, not all, but certainly most scientists, don't believe in God. And that means that, and by that, what that means is that there's a misunderstanding of the concept of being an atheist. Because some people think there's a difference between agnostics and atheists, and there isn't. I mean, in principle, because all agnostics are atheists. If you take by definition of atheism, meaning that there's not sufficient evidence to believe in any of the gods that people have suggested. Well, that's what an agnostic is. An agnostic is not saying there is no God, but I just don't find any evidence compelling. That's true for atheists. And once again, people talk as if there is a God, but you got to tell me which of the thousands and thousands of gods people have invented that you're talking about.
Okay. So this sounds like a little bit of a silly question, and this is my own. I have already ordered your book, The Physics of Star Trek, and I haven't read through it entirely yet. One of the big things that's always confused me is the particle replicator and how that could ever be an efficient method. Do you cover that in your book?
Of course.
Could you? I know you probably go in more depth there, but could you give me a brief primer on how that could work efficiently?
Well, it can't work efficiently if you're talking about replicating human beings, as I talk about, because the transporter is just a different version of the replicator, right? But the point of the replicator is just very simple. Take the information that makes up whatever you want it to be, an apple, and then scan an apple as at the best level you can, and then bring elements that make up an apple and put the atoms, place by place, and recreate the apple. Now, it sounds very easy. So in principle, it shouldn't be impossible. That's if you could find all the atoms and put them together and have the energy to do it, and the information storage and all the rest, all of which makes that difficult at best, if not impossible. But there is a problem in the sense that you really can't replicate macroscopic objects at the atomic level, because the laws of quantum mechanics basically say I can't probe those systems at the atomic level without disturbing them, so that I can never know exactly all of the properties of whatever atom in some system is doing, and where it's going, where it is and what it's doing at the same time. So I can only make an approximation. Now, that may be fine for replicating a glass of ginger beer, which I happen to be drinking right now, and we might not mind if we don't get things exactly right. But if we're talking about replicating a human being, you'd be more concerned. That's the short version. The much more eloquent version, I'm sure, is obtained by reading the book, but most importantly, by buying the book.
So Breezy asks, does eternity have a beginning?
One of my favorite lines about eternity comes from Woody Allen, who says eternity is a long time, especially near the end. But eternity can have a beginning, absolutely. The universe can be eternal in the future without being past eternal. Just like infinity doesn't require, I give you a mathematical example. Take the number line. Take the number line from 0 to positive infinity. That's infinite. Even if you haven't, it's also infinite if you take from negative infinity to infinity. Both of those are infinite. And if you wish, eternal lines. So yes, eternity can have a beginning but no end.
Okay. Ginbread Man asks, you travel around the world a lot. What was your most memorable place to visit and why?
Okay. I'm seeing some people who I think I recognize from other Discords too, but let's see. Well, let me just say that I people often ask me, what was your favorite X or what's the favorite Y? And if anyone's listening to me before, they realize that I don't tend to think in hierarchical terms like that. I don't tend to label best, next best, next best. I tend to just say apples and oranges. This was great and that was great. But as I go around the world, there are lots of places that I found maybe more fascinating than others. I was just in Vietnam and Cambodia, and I found them remarkable. The people in those places, remarkable. The culture, amazing. And as I described in lectures I gave on the trip that we organized as part of my new Origins Project Foundation, that it's sad that area is so endangered because of climate change. It'll be much more sensitive to climate change than many others. So Cambodia and Vietnam are one place. I should say that one of the reasons the Origins Project Foundation, which I'm the president of and we established, one of the reasons it runs travel adventures that we started to do is to go to the most exciting places in the world. And our next trip, and by the way, while we're here on January 31st, the early bird discount ends today. Our next trip is to Iceland and Greenland. And Greenland is a fascinating place and a landscape in peril. And while I haven't been there yet, I'm fascinated by it, and I expect I'll be fascinated by it. One of the other places that I've been to that I found sort of changed my view of the world was Antarctica. It was just like being there was like being on Earth before humans were ever there. The insignificance of it was a combination of recognizing how insignificant we are in one sense when you see the vastness of that continent, and at the same time realizing our impact when you see the effects of climate change. It's sort of a 1-2 punch, which I found fascinating. There are other places on Earth that are more, if you might say, more civilized that I found fascinating. I love visiting Venice, for example, but I found in almost every place I've gone that there are some things that are new and exciting, and that's the reason to travel. And I have to say that there are a lot of people lately who are saying we should never travel because of its impact on the climate. And I just think that's not the right attitude. I think we can try and reduce our carbon footprint in many, many ways. But I think travel is one of the most useful things we as humans can do to appreciate other humans. And I would never recommend that people don't travel.
Okay. So related on that, what are your thoughts on climate change? Some people talk about a global extinction event being near in our future. Do you see any credibility to that?
Well, I don't look. No. Well, I mean, maybe in the case of nuclear weapons, yes, but in climate change, it's not likely that it directly will cause global extinction. However, as I talked about recently on my Science Matters, the podcast, part of the podcast I do, the Origins project, the Origins podcast, Lawrence Krauss, we do once a month. I do a podcast where I talk about interesting science in the news, and the last one I talked about some recent developments that were published that are sobering, if not terrifying, that suggests that various tipping points, that if you look at climate change, it can produce many things. It can change sea levels, it can cause ice to melt, it can change the rainfall in certain places. And what's kind of remarkable is that there's a coupling between various of the severe possible outcomes from climate change, so that one can exacerbate the other, and we could produce severe severe, not just marginal, but severe changes in our planet, potentially with just a few degrees warming. It's somewhat speculative. So by no means could we prove that. But my attitude is, if it's even a possibility, we should look at the alternatives. And but what I do think is a potential danger that could lead to global extinction coming from climate change is the fact that if we have a world within this century in which there are hundreds of millions, if not billions, of climate refugees due to environments that become unlivable, either because sea level removes the coastline of Bangladesh or wherever else, or destroys or overwhelms the Mekong Delta, so rice can't be made there. We're gonna if there are tens or hundreds of millions of climate refugees, compare that to the current environment where there's a small fraction of those numbers of refugees, and it's producing global geopolitical tensions. If there are tens or hundreds of millions, I suspect the geopolitical tensions could be so great as to cause national or international conflicts. And since we have nuclear weapons, it might lead to some more severe things. So I think there may be many indirect routes by which climate change could cause disasters. And the sad thing about human-induced climate change is, first of all, it's happening. It's not some theory. It's really happening. But secondly, that as we want to mediate or reduce the potential impact, we can't afford to wait, because carbon dioxide that we put in the atmosphere now will remain in the atmosphere for 1,000 years. So every year that we wait, we have to cut back more the next year if we want to reduce the net total carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the effect of warming and its indirect impacts, besides also making the ocean more acidic and other things. So it's one of those things where, no, it's not like nuclear weapons. We're not going to go extinct directly because of climate change, nor is it immediate. If the most severe effects may take centuries, if not millennia in some ways. But it's something which we, as human beings who have foresight and knowledge, can look and say, here are possible consequences. What's the downside of doing something about it? Well, the downside is developing new and interesting technologies, which generally help economies and don't hurt them. So anyway, that's some general views on climate change. I'm actually planning to write some more about it. And one of the lectures I gave on the last Origins Project Foundation cruise in the Mekong on the physics of climate change will be available soon on the Foundation website, so people can watch it.
Do you mind if I ask you one more question on climate change?
Sure, go ahead.
So there is a kind of interplay going on here. The increase in CO2 emissions is mostly from developing countries, namely China and India. Last I looked, I think China emits about twice as much as the U.S. and also
with a population that's much big, more than twice as big. But anyway, go on. Yeah.
There are people who say that it's important to let developing countries, basically use coal and have a lot of emissions because if they do that, they'll be able to economically develop an economy that can then support green energy. Do you think allowing developing countries to emit a lot is a short-term
I don't think it's up to us to allow or not allow for countries to do the things they want. They have to have some self-determination in general. However, what we can do is we can help developing countries develop sources of energy that will be cleaner, so that they can achieve the kind of technology. We broke it. It's up to us to fix it. No matter what China does, right now, the bulk of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is going to stay there for 1,000 years and is going to impact on our climate as it is already, has been produced by the West, especially the United States. So it's not as if we could just say, oh, well, we're going to stop we're going to try and reduce our production of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we're fine. We helped create the problem, and you're right. Developing countries the people in developing countries have every right to live as quality lives as they can live. So what we can do, however, is we can look at techniques that'll aid through all of the world to move away from fossil fuels. And there are many things, including one of the things that isn't often most discussed, is to reduce the population growth. The biggest source of pollution and climate change is growing population, and we don't talk about it enough. And that's one of the reasons why, for example, I take when I hear the Pope, who sounds like it's supposed to be a nice guy, the new Pope sounds nicer, kinder, and gentler than the last Pope. Basically, he's no different in my mind. And when he starts talking about climate change as something we have an obligation to do something about, but he refuses to talk about birth control, I take his arguments not very seriously.
All right. So we were scheduled 45 minutes. We're now at 45 minutes.
I'll go a few extra minutes.
Okay.
If there are good questions.
All right.
I mean, more good questions. I don't mean the questions that have been asked on. I just mean, anyway, I'll take a few more questions.
Okay. Rapmanaj asks, so it starts out with really a statement here, but he says, all species on Earth have gone extinct. However, to the best of our knowledge, no species has ever been able to spread outside the Earth. If humans are able to spread beyond Earth, can we escape extinction? Or would the separations of humans across the cosmos cause evolution and a separation of humans into more distinct species?
Well, it's a long question, but let me just say they haven't all gone extinct. There are some species that are not extinct. 99.9% of all species that have ever been on Earth have gone extinct, and it's the norm. But one of the ways of going extinct is because of natural selection, of evolution. So species evolve, and so certainly Neanderthals went extinct, but some of the Neanderthal DNA is in us, and so yes, it's one of the reasons people talk about putting humans in space is to somehow avoid the possibility that we'll go extinct. I think that it's probably much more sensible to look at the much easier ways we can try and avoid going extinct here on Earth. Space isn't a cure-all. I mean, it's much easier to try and fix the at least technologically, not maybe politically, but technologically, it's much easier to fix the situation here on Earth than it is to send huge amounts of humans somewhere else. Humans evolved to live on Earth. We're not we're 200-pound bags or 100-pound bags of water. We didn't evolve to be in space. And in fact, space is a harsh environment. People don't realize, because they're bombarded by science fiction movies, how hard, expensive, and dangerous it is to travel in space. So human exploration of space sounds wonderful, and I have no doubt we'll do it at some point. From a scientific perspective, it's not particularly useful. We do the best science in space without humans. Astronauts don't help science very much. They help a little bit, but we do much more science with unmanned spacecraft and satellites and such. But yeah, why? Some people say let's hedge our bets and let's have a colony on Mars, so that if a large asteroid hits the Earth, then there'll be some human colony. Fine, but it's not so easy to imagine a colony on Mars. I expect in the long term, in tens of thousands or tens of thousands of years, we'll probably spread out if we survive beyond the Earth, and maybe those colonies will survive. And you're absolutely right. Once the way natural selection works is once populations are separated, then natural selection pressures could cause those different populations to evolve in different ways, and that causes speciation. So I do suspect if we ever had what were human colonies elsewhere in our solar system or elsewhere in the universe, within a certain amount of time, they would bear very little resemblance to the colonies that exist on Earth. Now, you could say then that if those new beings persist and hominids die out on Earth, then hominids have gone extinct. But all that's happened is that natural selection has allowed evolution into something else. It was a long answer, but I hope it was clear.
Yeah, I think so. So user Virtuous asks, is there any scientific basis for reincarnation and karma in physics/nature and the multi-world theory of the universe?
Well, there's no scientific basis for reincarnation, and there's every bit of scientific arguments to show it's complete nonsense. So not least in the sense that there are more people alive now than there have been throughout most of human history. So you know, we can't be reincarnated. But besides the fact that there's no evidence for it, it's just nonsense, and it's one of the reasons why. And I'll make some more enemies here. Why that I'm not so impressed with the Dalai Lama, who, by comparison to the Pope or other people, appears to be much more responsive to science. He's often said, if science, ever disagrees with tenets of Buddhism, then we'll change the tenets of Buddhism. Yet he's the Dalai Lama because of this nonsense claim that somehow he's the reincarnation of a past Dalai Lama. So there's no evidence of that. But there is indirect theoretical evidence that there may be what we call a multiverse. There may be many different universes. They don't communicate with each other, but our universe may not be unique. But we don't die off and suddenly appear somewhere else as a another being. That's just scientific nonsense. There's no evidence for that. And as I say, every bit of rational thinking about it suggests that the idea is nonsense.
So would you say the same about karma?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the physicist Richard Feynman, who you mentioned earlier, and I often talk about, used to go up to people and say, "You won't believe what happened to me today. You just won't believe it." And people say, "What?" And he'd say, "Absolutely nothing." and the reason was that when things happen to us, most of what happens to us we don't notice. We can dream, have a million crazy dreams on a given night. And then we might dream one night that our friend breaks their arm, and the next day that we find our friend breaks their leg, and we say, it's significant. We humans often ascribe significance to things that are just coincidence. And the world is just full of accidents. And when something significant happens, it's probably because you notice it and not because there's something behind it. So there's no evidence of karma, and the world is the way it is, whether we like it or not. And I think what we can do is enjoy the world for what it is and not make up lots of myths and superstition about the world we'd like to live in. Maybe that's a good way to end, unless there's a really good question next.
So I'm seeing just a couple more really good questions here. About with the coronavirus in mind, how serious do you take the threat of homemade bioterrorism?
I used to take it more seriously than I do. When in the process of being the chair of the board of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, we used to have symposia where we'd bring experts in, and to talk about things. And one of the things we talked about was bioterrorism, or even biohacking. And the point is, yes, it's a concern, but what's interesting is that I'm not as there are a number of reasons in terms of global pandemics that I'm not so concerned, because life has evolved 4 billion years to counter things, and only those things that have managed to survive and counter life are still around as viral threats. So it's hard to imagine something that hasn't had the experience of countering the immune system in many ways of living beings. Life is very, very robust, and it's hard to imagine something that hasn't had billions of years of training to overcome that could be effective in terms of producing some global threat. But there's also the question of manufacturing it efficiently and effectively, and in a way which is not noticed by any groups that might govern that kind of activity, and also dissemination. All of those things mean that we could imagine bioterror. We could imagine hurting a local population and doing great damage. But in terms of some hacker producing some global pandemic, I'm less concerned about it than I used to be, based on my discussions with at least some biologists.
All right. So if we can just get one last question here. Whiskey Renegade wants to know. So you've talked a little bit about religion and how you don't see any basis for it. And basically, Whiskey Renegade wants to know: would you look at the idea that there are aliens in the same way, or is that somehow more credible?
Well, the existence of potential aliens is incredibly credible, if you want to call it that. There's 100 billion stars in our galaxy, 100 billion galaxies in the universe, and almost all stars have planets around them. And as far as we can tell, organic materials, water, and sunlight, which is what was necessary for life to evolve here on Earth, are ubiquitous throughout our galaxy. And so we've discovered the basis of amino acids in space. So I would be amazed if the universe at some level wasn't teeming with life. Now, intelligent life is a different question. Intelligence isn't an evolutionary imperative, and many systems could evolve without any intelligence and still have life there. So aliens, the likelihood seems to me that there's intelligent life in the universe, if I had to guess, and it really is just a guess, seems high. But the likelihood that we're going to interact with that other intelligence is incredibly low. The universe is a big place. It's very hard to communicate and to know what to communicate over. And so and that's just communication. But we're not going to be traveling through the galaxies and spacecrafts at the speed of light. And aliens aren't doing that either. To travel in a spacecraft, anything approaching the speed of light would require harnessing the power output of a star. And I certainly don't think they're coming all the way here just to do weird, kinky experiments on Earth. So I think the point is that if we discover evidence of life elsewhere in the universe, it'll be by communication, but that communication will be extremely slow because the universe is a big place. But I think it's a long shot that we'll ever know about life elsewhere in the universe, even as I say that I think it's highly likely that stuff exists. So I think it's well motivated, unlike religion, which is not well motivated at all. Okay. Maybe that's a good way to end.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming out, Lawrence. We really appreciate it. So guys, I've posted Lawrence Krauss's Twitter in our announcements. Do you have any other social media you'd like us to link?
Well, I mean, you've got the Twitter, and the webpage for the Origins Project Foundation is originsprojectfoundation.org, and the webpage for the Origins Project, which runs the podcast, is theoriginsproject.com. And then, of course, my own webpage is lawrencemkrauss.com. So those are a bunch of things you can use to find out about the things we're doing. And the podcast, by the way, is also available on YouTube. And it's a video podcast. And we've had some of the most exciting guests in the world. I'm very excited about that. So I hope to see some of you on our Greenland voyage. And if you sign up and to put a deposit today, you'll get a $500 discount. And I hope the rest of you enjoy some of the things we produce. So thanks again.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.